Welcome to a walkthrough of the 3 through 5 Integrated Strand Unit Internalization. 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers should complete this unit internalization template prior to beginning a unit. The unit internalization template helps teachers identify the learning goals of each integrated strand unit, plan daily instruction to meet these goals, and should be completed prior to starting any new unit. The template in front of you is what we will be using for today's Integrated Strand Unit Internalization. As you can see, this template is broken into 2 distinct sections. For the first 5 questions on our template, we will be using the unit overview. To do this, we will look into our teacher guide and read through the introduction, which provides all of the information we will need in order to think through these first 5 questions. The second portion of our unit internalization is looking at the unit assessment. We will use the unit assessment, study it in more depth, and answer all of these questions based on what we find within the unit assessment. Again, all of the information that we need to complete and plan our unit internalization can be found directly in your teacher guide. You have a teacher guide for every unit of study within the curriculum. So we're going to head to a teacher guide now. For today's purposes, we're going to be using grade 3, unit 1. As I scroll through my teacher guide, you will notice that every teacher guide within the curriculum begins with a table of contents. This table of contents gives you an overview of every lesson that is included within this particular unit. The unit we're going to be working through today is animal classification. You'll notice the first part of this teacher guide is the introduction. Again, remember that's the portion that we will be utilizing for the first 5 questions on our unit internalization document. As I scroll down, you will continue to see the different lessons that are incorporated within this unit of study. When I get to my last unit, you'll notice that there's a unit assessment. Every unit within your curriculum ends with a unit assessment, and that is what we will utilize to fill out the second portion of our unit internalization document. There are also teacher resources that are listed at the end of your teacher guide that are really important resources that you will want to make sure you're familiar with and that you look through prior to teaching each unit of instruction. Before we get into our planning, I want to just do a brief walkthrough of the introduction. It's very important that you read through the entire introduction. We'll be using most portions of it to complete our unit internalization today, but I want to just show you exactly the information that's included because it's very important and helps you understand your unit ahead. So it talks about animal classification, which is the unit we're going to be using for today's purposes. It gives you a breakdown. It has 15 lessons, 2 pausing point days, how much time is required. Again, it's 3rd grade, so that's 120 minutes of core instruction. Then it breaks down the different skills that are covered: reading, spelling, grammar, morphology. So we'll be looking back into that as we do our unit internalization. Why this particular unit is important. What prior knowledge our students will have when they come to this unit. What writing we will be completing throughout the unit, as well as performance tasks and assessments, and highlighting a fluency supplement that is also included. Gives you a highlight of the instructional components, as well as the academic and core vocabulary that you will be teaching from lesson to lesson. So as you can see, this unit introduction is a wealth of information, and we highly encourage you spend some time reading through it in its entirety prior to starting your unit internalization. I am going to head back to our document so we can get started. Again, we're going to be starting with the unit overview section where we will be reading through the introduction. The first question is asking, why is this unit so important? If you remember, when I gave you a brief overview of this introduction, we came to a portion that says specifically why animal classification is important. So I am going to be reading through this section and using whatever stands out to me as important information to document on my unit internalization template. For example, this unit introduces students to the science of classification. Students will learn about 5 groups of vertebrates, why scientists classify animals into groups, and the characteristics by which they make these determinations. So as I continue reading through this portion of why this unit is important, I am then going to determine which pieces I want to add onto my unit internalization. I provided a bulleted list for myself. Again, this is a planning document for you. So how you determine you want to use it, if you want to use it digitally as I have, or if you want to print out the template and fill it in by hand, whatever system works best for you and helps you plan for your unit ahead. I decided to bullet some of the key points that I took away of why this unit was important for my students. It introduces students to scientific classification. They'll learn why scientists classify animals and what characteristics they use to classify animals. It also is important because it will provide my students with the ability to classify information, which is an essential skill of organizing, analyzing, and understanding data. And then finally, it will help my students develop scientific skills, such as observing and identifying characteristics of objects and animals. We're going to move on to the second question that's under that unit overview section, and that is, what are 3 to 5 key takeaways students should have by the end of this unit? I'm going to go back into my unit introduction, and if you remember, right above why this unit was important, it broke down the different skills my students would be working on in this unit. So I read through the reading portion in its entirety, the spelling portion, the grammar portion, and the morphology portion. And after reading through that, I decided to record the following 3 to 5 takeaways. By the end of this unit, my students should have the ability to engage in discussion and make reasonable statements based on what they already know and what they have observed. In writing, they will be learning how to introduce a topic. They will learn to group related information together and provide supporting ideas, facts, and details. They'll also have an understanding of how to use graphic organizers to gather and categorize information from reading or from the read aloud, or to plan for writing. So they're going to be using graphic organizers throughout. They will be introduced to abstract nouns and will discover the differences between concrete and abstract nouns in a sentence. And they will also be learning prefixes un, non, re, and pre. So as you can see, I gathered all of that information directly from my introduction, where it broke down the different skills that my students will be focusing on in this unit. Moving on, it's asking what formal writing piece will students complete during this unit. Again, I'm going right back into the introduction of my unit. And if you remember, as I scrolled down in my general overview, I got to a portion that is writing. So I'm going to read this section, and right away you will see the formal writing piece for the animal classification unit is a short informational writing piece that focuses on organizing and communicating characteristics and classification of one specific vertebrae. I'm going to continue to read through the rest of this information and then again summarize what I read in this section on my internalization document. So the formal writing piece is an informational writing piece that focuses on organizing and communicating characteristics and classifications of one specific vertebrae. As you can tell, although this template looks like it's a very lengthy template, the planning and the time that it's involved in looking at this unit as a whole is actually relatively quick because of all the information being found in this introduction portion for this beginning of the unit internalization. So don't be intimidated by 3 pages of planning, and as with every process, the more and more you do it, the easier and easier it becomes, and you'll be able to do it relatively quickly once you get more and more familiar with this unit internalization itself, as well as the components that you have available to you within your teacher guide. I'm going to move on to how does this unit reinforce what has been taught in previous grades. So again, I'm still in that first section of my unit internalization. So I am going to go back into my introduction, and you'll notice that there's a section that states prior knowledge. Because this is a third grade unit, it is going to show me all the previous grades leading up to this and how that background knowledge has been built up to this unit. So it shows me in kindergarten what they learned about in their farms unit, first grade what they learned about in their animal and habitat unit, and then in second grade there were two different domains that help support this unit of study in third grade, and that is the cycles of nature and insects. So I read through all of these bulleted points, went back into my internalization document, and I listed it by grade level, what the unit was, and then I pulled what I felt was important that was helping build the background knowledge required for the unit that I'm about to teach. So in kindergarten, when they were studying farms, they learned to identify animals and their needs. In first grade, in their animals and habitats domain, they described habitats and did that classification piece of habitats and animals. That looked like an important bit of information for me to remember. In the cycles of nature, they looked at life cycles and the stages, and for insects, they really focused on the insect species and working to explain and describe, and that's important background knowledge for what they will be doing in this next unit in third grade. The final portion of this section of my internalization document is thinking about what additional materials do I need to prepare to support all my learners, including English language learners, gifted and talented, and students with disabilities. Again, when I'm looking into my introduction, you will notice that there are different instructional components listed, teacher resources. It highlighted some digital resources. These are things that I want to make sure that I have available for my students who can be supported by being able to see visuals, whether it be different concepts I'm teaching throughout this unit or for vocabulary. So I noted that. There's also a fluency supplement that we'll get to when we get to the assessment piece that I may want to utilize on some of my students to see where their fluency is. But as you read through this, you'll notice the different components within the unit to help you guide what you want to include on this portion of your internalization. So I wrote down those digital resources, including visuals for sure for those students, so I can support all my learners in my classroom. And then I after reading through this introduction, I saw reference to utilizing graphic organizers, not just for writing, but to comprehend what was the reading that was going on throughout the unit, as well as charts. So I put that as an additional material that I wanted to make sure that I had accessible to all my learners. All right, as you can see on the screen in front of you, we just completed that unit overview portion. So we've already made it through these first three questions just simply by looking into our teacher guide in that introduction provided in every unit of study. And you can see how easily and specifically it was laid out for you. But again, so we get this big picture idea of what we're going to be teaching in the unit ahead prior to getting into those individual lessons. Let's move on to the unit assessment piece. The first question under this portion is asking us to review the unit assessment and list the key sections of the assessment. In our unit internalization template, it says to read through the unit assessment in the student activity book and the correct answers in the teacher guide and respond to the questions below. I want to show you that in the teacher guide, all of the student activity pages are listed there as an answer guide, and I like to use that as I'm planning because it's all, again, in my teacher guide, but you can also access the student activity book from the website to go through this portion of the internalization. So let's go and review the assessment. Again, I'm going to take you back to that table of contents. If you remember, it laid out exactly where my assessment was within this unit, so I don't have to scroll through this entire teacher guide. but rather I'm going to scroll to the end of all of the lessons because that unit assessment is in the final lesson of the unit on page 308. So let's go ahead and head to that portion of my teacher guide right now. As you can see, here is the unit assessment. It has the primary focuses, objectives for these unit assessments broken down by the language objectives, reading objectives, and foundational skills objectives. There's also a spelling assessment that is part of this unit assessment. Again, another great way to look at this unit assessment as a whole is at this lesson at a glance, where it tells me each assessment that will be used, and then exactly what the grouping is for the assessment, as well as what materials I will need. So I use this lesson at a glance to fill out this initial portion just so I knew exactly what the different key sections of the assessment were. And I notated that my language assessment was going to be a spelling assessment. I even put the activity book page here just for quick reference as I'm getting into the unit and how that is going to be assessed. So this is a whole group assessment. There's a reading student skills assessment, which is an independent assessment. There's also a small group remediation assessment included in this unit, if I need to use that for small group instruction, as well as an optional fluency assessment that we'll take a look at. So in this portion, I'm just listing those key sections of the assessment. The next portion, we will be utilizing the text complexity rubric that was part of the pre-work for today's session. Again, there are two different text complexity rubrics, one for literary text and one for informational. And for this particular assessment, as I read through it, which I'm going to show you in a moment, I'm going to be using that informational text complexity rubric. So now I want to get into my actual reading comprehension portion of the unit assessment. So I'm going to continue to scroll through. Again, the first assessment is language. I want to get to my reading portion. In my reading portion, you'll notice it tells me exactly the length of time this should take, which teaks this is addressing, and it lays out to me exactly what I need to be doing. I'm going to continue to scroll down because I want to also show you this lists all of the different ones by category, okay? But now I do want to take you to the student activity book because this is where I'm going to be able to see this assessment in its entirety and really get a good understanding in utilizing that text complexity rubric. So in my student activity book, it notated that it was assessment page 15.2. So this is the assessment. It's titled Beavers. I noticed right away that it's informational text. There are photographs with captions included. So it's a multiple page assessment that's in my students' activity books. But then here we get into the text itself. So I want to spend some time reading through the text that my students will be reading so that I can look at that text complexity rubric and fill it out and get a good understanding of that reading portion of my assessment. So as you can notice, now it's a hummingbird's piece of text. So I realized in looking over the unit assessment that my students are going to be comparing text, that they're going to be utilizing text features, including photographs with captions as well as maps. And then they're going to be reading about two different types of animals. So they're going to be doing a comparison. I also noticed the different vocabulary, and I got a chance to look through the questions to see exactly what my students are going to be asked. So when I went back into this part of my unit internalization, it tells me to use my text complexity rubric to guide my thinking. So I have that text complexity rubric right here. It's broken into these different categories: text structure, language features, purpose, knowledge, demands. Here is what this text complexity rubric looks like. And again, this was part of your pre-work. So you're going to utilize this to decide what is incorporated that is providing a level of complexity and why. what is included and how is that making the text more complex. So I spent a good amount of time going through that assessment on my own, reading through the text itself, the questions my students were going to be answering, the vocabulary, and as I did that, I compared that to my text complexity rubric, and I gathered this information. As far as text structure, what made this text complex is that there were photos in there with captions that offered key understanding to the text. There were explicit connections between ideas within the text, and there was a focus on text features that were included with both photos and maps. For the language features section, I noticed the use of figurative language throughout, and again, these categories are specific from my text complexity rubric. I noticed some complex vocabulary, words like gnaw, extinction, hover, that my students in the assessment were asked questions about. I also noticed that they were asked to refer back into their text to prove their answers, so that was an important piece for me as I'm preparing for this unit of study. As far as purpose, they were comparing these two texts, making inferences about them, and there were multiple purposes behind these two texts, not only to inform students on the subject matter, but also to have them compare the two texts and the features that were found within the text. And then finally, as far as knowledge demands, they were asked to really look at specific information. So I pulled the discipline-specific information directly from my text rubric. So again, I just wanted to show you this is included in your pre-work, and this is the one I used because it was an informational text, but there's a second text complexity rubric that you can also use for literary text as well. So moving on through our unit internalization, the next portion is asking what literacy skills will students need to be successful on the reading comprehension portion of the unit assessment. So again, that's that assessment that I just spent a good amount of time looking through. I'm going to go ahead and revisit it to make sure I can see exactly what literacy skills my students are going to be focusing on. Keep in mind, you can always go back to that lesson overview page where it will specifically state the TEKS that are being addressed for the assessment. That's a great guide to help you pull this information. So for this, it's the comparison of text, providing text evidence in their answers, the understanding of the different text features that were covered throughout the unit, as well as vocabulary. This next portion talks about fluency. If you remember, when we were in our unit assessment, when we were looking through it, as an overview, it showed me that there was an optional fluency assessment, and the title was Piranhas. So again, it's optional. I may choose to just utilize this for a small group of students. I may decide from unit to unit how to utilize this. So I periodically am getting a fluency assessment on my whole class, but not having to do the whole class for every single unit. So this this question that we're looking at on our utilization, our internalization document is asking what fluency score do students need to be in the 50th percentile or above at this time of year? So I'm going to take you down to that fluency assessment. We're in this same section, and you'll notice right here, we're still in that lesson 15 where the unit assessment was, and here is that optional fluency assessment. It tells me that activity page 15.3 is what I'll be utilizing. There are recording and scoring sheets specifically included for this particular fluency assessment, as well as comprehension questions to be asking. And then you'll also notice here some guidelines for calculating the words correct per minute so that you have some guidance as you are utilizing this with your students. Again, I'm going to go back into my student activity book so I can show you exactly where this is within the student activity book. Here is that fluency assessment. So students will bring their student activity book for you, and you can make your markings right on this particular document. And then here is where you will calculate the words correct per minute. And remember that question, where do my students need to be to fall in the 50th percentile? They need to be at 71 words correct per minute. So you will have a chart included within the fluency assessment in the student activity book. So I simply just wrote that down so I could easily reference that as I am using the fluency unit assessment with particular students. The last portion of our unit internalization template looks at the morphology and grammar skills that students need to master to be successful on the unit assessment. So again, I'm going right back into my teacher guide. I'm still in my unit assessment portion, which is part of the last lesson in my teacher guide. And this is looking at the language portion. So I'm going to scroll back up to the beginning, and here is my language portion. It's showing me this is a spelling assessment that is going to be focused on what I've already explicitly taught my students. As I continue to look through and scroll through the assessment here, as well as remember page 15.1 in my student activity book. So I'm going to go back up to my student activity book so you can see what this page, it's a spelling assessment that students will be completing. Whoops, let me get all the way back up before that reading assessment portion that we spent some time with. And you will notice where the spelling assessment is. So you'll notice that we're focusing on adding that suffix ES. As I was reading through my teacher guide, it gave me some other pointers about how it's tricky for my students to know when to change the Y to I, and it explained that all in the spelling assessment chart that was part of my teacher guide. So what I made sure to put on here, is we are focusing on plural spelling of the suffix ES and changing the Y to I before adding that suffix. So that's the particular morphology and grammar skill that students need to master in order to be successful. We covered a lot of information going through this unit internalization document. As you can tell, going step to step is relatively simple and quick because of how all this information is laid out for you within the teacher guide. So don't be surprised if the first couple times that you are utilizing this internalization document, it takes a little bit longer. That's okay because you're getting comfortable and familiar with how the units are laid out as well as the different components within it. Remember, it is really important to have that big picture understanding of each unit before you dive into those individual lessons and individual lesson planning. This big picture is going to help you understand how each lesson within your unit fits into the scope and sequence. It's also going to help you understand how this unit builds in order to set your students up for success throughout from lesson to lesson. Thank you so much for taking some time to walk through this 3 through 5 Integrated Strand Unit Internalization template, and I wish you happy planning.